Hi, everyone, and welcome to this Stylus Authors webinar with Saundra McGuire. I'm so happy to have you here. If you can hear and see us both broadcasting to you, please go ahead and let us know in the chat, which I think you've already found if you've been telling us where you're coming from. Let us know if you can hear everything there. Great. Thank you so much, Bonnie. Excellent. So before I introduce our guest today, I want to make sure you know, please use the chat for back channeling as we're going through the webinar. Please let us know where you're coming from. We can see people from all over coming into the webinar. And also I want to point out that at the bottom of your screen, there's an Ask a Question button. And this allows you to give us a specific question that we can then timestamp the answer in the video. So you can ask a question in the chat, or you can ask a question in that feature. Please, I recommend using the feature so that we can make sure and timestamp it for people who might watch this in the future. So I'm thrilled today to be talking with author Saundra McGuire, who has a couple of wonderful books that I know that many of you are probably very familiar with. The one we're going to be talking about today is Teach Yourself How to Learn. It is linked in the bottom of the webinar if you want to take a look and learn more. But also I thought I would start by having Saundra say hello, but also differentiate between this book and her other book on Teach Students How to Learn, because they're kind of similar to each other. So Saundra, you want to say hello?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. And thanks so much, Katie. Yeah, I'm really excited to be doing this and talking about the books. And I'll tell you the relationship between the two. Teach Students How to Learn was the one that came out in 2015. And I wrote that book because when I discovered that there were very simple, straightforward strategies that we could teach students that would enable students to go from making D's and F's 1 week to A's and B's 3 weeks later. And I found that just like I didn't know those strategies, many faculty didn't either. So I wanted to write that book to give faculty very straightforward strategies that we could use. And though I found that there were a lot of students who were reading the Teach Students How to Learn and getting a lot out of it, because in fact, if you look in the reviews on Amazon, the longest review in Amazon was written by a student at Westmont College in California. And he actually took pictures of pages in the book and posted them in his review. And often when I'd go places to speak, a faculty member would say, "Oh, I bought that for my son, and he was making C's before, and now he's making A's in his classes." And so our younger daughter is my co-author, Stephanie McGuire, and we decided that since so many students were reading the book that we wrote for faculty, we wanted to have a book that was written to and for students instead of a book that was written to faculty about students. And so we said, well, we'll write one, Teach Yourself How to Learn. And the books are probably, I'd say maybe 80% similar, but the Teach Yourself How to Learn has 2 fewer chapters. It has 10 as opposed to 12. The chapter on and Teach Students How to Learn, there's a chapter on teaching these strategies to large groups, and we didn't put that in there, and because of course students wouldn't be teaching it to large groups. And then there's a chapter on partnering with your campus learning center in the Teach Students How to Learn book that's not in the Teach Yourself How to Learn. But we included in Teach Yourself How to Learn information about the importance of sleep, of nutrition, of getting enough exercise, and that we didn't have in Teach Students How to Learn. So they're very similar, but one is directed more to faculty and the other more to students. At any level, I might add.
All right, so let's jump into some questions here. Please feel free to ask your own questions as we go along. But I want to start first, Saundra, by asking, what are some of the benefits you found for students in understanding their own learning better? Why do they need this information?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. And the way you posed it is very interesting because you said, why do students need to learn about their own learning? I really think that students need to learn about learning in general, and we'll talk about their own learning in just a minute. But it's so evident that most students who come to college, I mean, really at any level, they really have no idea what learning involves. They've done a lot of memorization, they've done a lot of regurgitating, they've done a lot of getting information in short-term memory and then having to spit it out on a test or a quiz within the next 15, 20 minutes. But the idea of learning, getting information, processing it, and being able to retrieve that information later that's something that most students are not aware of. And it is what is derailing most of our students' success in college. It's not that they're not very capable students, it's not that they can't learn. But when I've asked students, what did most of your high school teachers do the day before the test in high school? They'll say review, and I expected that. But then when I asked them, what did they do during the review? Most of them said they gave us the test questions and we went over the answers. And so they've never had an experience where they've got to take responsibility for their own learning. And I think that is really important because it's a skill not that they just have to use in their college courses to succeed, but this is a skill that they need in life. Now, the idea of knowing about their own learning, sometimes that makes people think about your individual learning style. And I don't know how many of our viewers out there know that learning styles have fallen into ill repute lately. In fact, I'm going to ask you to just put in the chat box if you knew that learning styles have fallen into ill repute. Just indicate yes or no. And they, okay, yep, yeah. And whenever I talk, I always ask that question because I actually think, okay, learning preferences. Yes, Bonnie says learning preferences. And so I call them learning preferences now. And I think that those are very important for students to know if they have a preference for visuals or auditory or read write, because there was actually a paper by Pasha, Pasche, others, and co-authors, and that paper, it didn't say that there was no use to learning styles. What they did say was there's no scientific evidence that teaching students about their learning style would increase learning. And I think people misinterpreted that to think that we shouldn't say anything about learning styles or learning style preferences because the research doesn't support that. But even in that paper, they say that they can't say that learning styles are not useful, learning style preferences, but there's nothing that would indicate that teaching students about their individual learning styles would increase learning. And I totally agree with that because just because someone shows me very effective ways, for example, for baking a cake, that doesn't mean that I'm going to bake a cake any better than anybody else, because if I don't use the things that they told me to do, then the cake is going to come out lousy. But I also in the book put in the paper that kind of debunks the paper that debunks learning styles. And I'll tell you this really quickly. My own learning style, I guess the journey. I initially did not believe in learning styles at all. My first introduction to learning styles was one of my colleagues at Cornell. We had really large classes there, and she came back from a very large class, and she said, Saundra, she said, I had a student who came up to me after class and said, I'm a kinesthetic learner. I need to be up and moving around to learn chemistry in your class. And I looked at her and I said, really? That's kind of interesting. And then I thought these learning styles people were trying to tell me that I needed to know the learning style of every one of my students and teach them according to their style. But that was not logistically feasible. So I had totally written off learning styles. And my attitude about learning styles was essentially learning styles, I teach, you learn. That's the style in my class. But then when I got to LSU, they were teaching students about learning styles with great success. And I think what happens, and I say in the book that, who knows, it may be a placebo, but I think the importance of teaching students about learning style preferences is this. And my approach is I think students need to know about all of I like the VARK, the visual, oral, read, write, kinesthetic. They need to know about all of those as possible preferences. And they need to know effective strategies that go along with each of those preferences. So that if they're in a class that the instructor is using a style that is not congruent with their preference, they'll have strategies to use for that particular style. And I'm going to do a little activity with you now to demonstrate what I think is really the equivalence of teaching students about learning style preferences. So what I want everybody to do is just take your hands and just clasp them together as I've done. And then I want you to look down and see which thumb is on top. And if you have, well, put in the chat box whether you have your right thumb on top or your left thumb on top. And I'm going to see how we shake out. Okay, so I see right, left, left, right, left. Okay, yeah, it's playing out exactly the way it does in person. That we're about 50-50 with either right or left on top. And so now what I want you to do is, and Craig has already said it, I want you to keep your fingers the same, but just put the other thumb on top. And Craig has already told us that the other one feels really weird. Now what I want you to do is keep the other thumb on top, but then just take your fingers and intersperse them differently. And I just want you to indicate, oh, somebody said there are 5 rights and 2 lefts. Okay, I wasn't counting. I thought I saw, yeah, I see 3 lefts. Oh, you must be in the room. Okay, Sanford, you're in the room with a lot of people. Interesting, 5 rights and 2 lefts. Normally it comes out more even. But in any event, when we did this, when we changed our thumbs, it felt really weird. But if you changed your fingers, that should have felt a little bit better. Did that feel a little bit better? Somebody put yes or no in the chat box. It's still not going to, yeah. And it's still not going to be normal. So if you went into a space and somebody said, I want you to clasp your hands, you're going to clasp them the way that's most comfortable for you. But if somebody says, I want you to clasp your hands and you have to put the thumb on top that's not most comfortable for you, now you know that there's something I can do. I can just change my fingers and it will make it a little bit more comfortable. You're right. It's still going to be awkward, but not as awkward as it was before. And I think that's the same thing with learning style preferences. If I have a very strong preference for visual information, but I'm in a class with an instructor who has a text with no pictures and there's no visuals at all, I know that, if I read the information and create a diagram for myself, or if I draw a picture of the information, that's going to be something that's going to help me learn the information, then that's going to make a big difference. And so, Katie, to get back to your original question, that's kind of a long way of saying that I think it's most important for students to learn about learning in general, that learning is a process and not an activity that happens the night before a test. But I think it's also important that they learn about their preference for different styles. And I also, in the books, I talk about Myers-Briggs personality tests. And when I got to LSU, I've not ever done a personality test. And my colleagues were saying, Saundra, you need to take this Myers-Briggs test. And I said, no, I don't need to take a personality test. I'm a chemistry professor. Molecules don't have personalities. I don't need to know about personalities. But they kept at it. So I took the test. And to make a long story short, I think that helping students understand about extroverts and introverts really, really important because students are working in groups and the extroverts are thinking that the introverts are sitting there like bumps on a log, don't have anything to contribute because they're not jumping in. The introverts are wondering when the extroverts are going to shut up so that they can tell them what's going on. And I think if students knew about this, it would be much easier for them to control the flow of information and invite the introverts in. The other Myers-Briggs scale that I think is very important is the J&P, judging and perceiving. And for those of you who might not be familiar with it, the J's are people who like to get things done. They like to have lists. They check off that they've done this. Whereas P's, the perceivers, like to really spend a lot more time ruminating, thinking, well, what if I do it this way? What if I do it that way? And the J's who want to get things just checked off, they may not get their best work done because they just want to get it done and turn it in. And the P's might have a problem where they're always turning in stuff late because they're always thinking about how can I think of it a different way. And so I think if students knew whether they were more J or P, then they could have strategies. The J's could say, I'm not going to turn it in until I give myself another time to look at it. The P's could say, well, I'm going to give myself a timeline and I'm not just going to leave this open-ended. So I think that when students know more about their own individual characteristics as learners, it makes a big difference. Okay, and I see Bonnie says, and I can and should get used to changing up my finger clasping and learn new learning styles so I can expand. Great.
All right, let's dive into another question. So Throughout this book and also throughout its kind of partner book, metacognition is a really key concept. This is a kind of a buzzword. A lot of people are talking about metacognition, and you kind of just addressed it a little bit, just in different language. But can you give it a quick definition and maybe an example of what you're talking about?
Sure.
You have such a
Yes.
fun way of describing it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, and the reason it came about, I think, because when I got to LSU, and I really credit my colleagues at LSU for introducing me to the idea that we could teach students strategies and very rapidly and significantly increase their learning, their performance in courses. Because as a chemistry professor coming from Cornell University, I really did think that there were certain students who had organic chemistry ability and others who didn't. And if you didn't have that ability and you came to me, you flunked the first two tests and came to me wanting to know what you could do because you wanted to become a brain surgeon, I'd say, what's your backup plan? Tell me your backup plan. And so my colleagues at LSU introduced me to this idea that we really can help students increase their learning. And so then I started reading everything I could get my hands on to see how to effectively communicate this with students. And I came across this concept of metacognition. And I was intrigued by it. And I thought that it would be a good way to introduce students to what they needed to do in the learning environment. Because I'd been to lots of great faculty development workshops, but all of those workshops really concentrated on what we as faculty could do to improve our teaching. We could flip our classrooms, we could do more active learning strategies, but it always seemed to me that we were leaving out 50% of the equation, because if students didn't come to the table understanding their role in the process, we weren't going to get the kind of learning gains we could if they understood that. And so I was always looking for a way to help students understand what their role is. And when I came across this concept of metacognition, I thought that that would be a good way to explain this to students. And it was going to be much more attractive than telling students we're going to give them study skills, because students' eyes typically glaze over if we're saying study skills. But if we call it learning strategies and metacognitive learning strategies, then they find that very interesting. And the other thing, now I read a lot about metacognition, and there's some very sophisticated definitions of metacognition, but I like to keep it very simple, because I think if students are going to do anything with the information, it has to be simple enough that they can understand exactly what we're talking about. So my very simple definition of metacognition is, well, it's the ability to think about your own thinking. And when I explain it to students, I say it's really kind of like if you had a big brain outside your brain looking at what your brain is doing. And that big brain is asking your brain questions. And it's saying, does she really understand this information, or did she just memorize it last night because the test is today? It's saying, if she's got a paper that she has to write, does she know that she needs to think about it early? She needs to develop a draft for the instructor to look at, or is she just planning to whip it out the night before the way she did it in high school? It's your ability to know what you know and what you don't know. So you don't show up at a test thinking, okay, I studied, I know this stuff, I'm good. And then you look at the first three questions and realize, no, I don't know this stuff at all. It's your ability to recognize that you are a problem solver, that when issues come up, you don't need somebody else to solve everything for you. You can figure some things out. And the example I like to give is, I say, most of the questions that students ask us about our courses, and I'm going to ask this, somebody put it in the chat box, where could they find that information? Most of the questions that students ask us about our courses, where could they find that information? Exactly, on the syllabus. And so if a student is not using their metacognitive brain, then they'll say, well, I wonder when the next test is. I wonder how many tests we're going to have. And the metacognitive brain says, well, we have resources. We can answer that question. And the brain says, well, what am I supposed to use? And the metacognitive brain says, well, what did the instructor give us? And so it leads them to the syllabus. So I think it allows students to be in proactive mode as opposed to reactive mode. And it really empowers them to be more in charge of their own learning, more self-directed. And so that's why I really like the term metacognition. And I find that students really respond well to it. and it's just made a big difference. Now, let me just do this, Katie, for a minute, because I see Richard is here. Hi, Richard. Richard Felder is the person that I mentioned. I put the paper in the book that debunked the paper that debunked learning styles, allegedly. And so I just want to read, he said, and teachers should make sure to address learning styles in a balanced way, so all students will sometimes be taught in their preferred style, which will keep them from being too uncomfortable to learn, and sometimes in their less preferred style, which will help them develop other important skills that they be just as happy to ignore. Absolutely. Thanks so much for saying that, Richard, because Mark McDaniel wrote the foreword to Teach Yourself How to Learn. And Mark McDaniel was one of the authors on the paper that people think debunked learning styles. And so when I asked Mark to write the foreword, I said, well, Mark, I got to warn you, we talk about learning styles, although it didn't end up in the final copy of the book. But he said that he liked the way we addressed it because we did it exactly, Richard, the way we suggest. We tell the instructors to just teach a variety of learning styles so that you, and this is what I understood later, those learning styles people were trying to get me to do. They weren't trying to tell me I needed to know the learning style of all of my students and teach them according to that style, which I had misinterpreted. They were saying I needed to know about all of the different styles and make sure that my instruction covered a number of different styles. And Richard, thank you for that comment. You're right on target.
Awesome. Okay. If there are additional questions that you have, please feel free to drop them into the Ask a Question. I'm going to keep going because I have plenty here myself, but please feel free if you have additional questions you want to pose. I'm curious, Saundra, if you can talk about in your experience working with different campuses and working with different students, what are some of the common learning pitfalls that you see students struggling with?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was, Make It Stick. I see Melissa put that in. That's the book that Mark McDaniel is a co-author on. So that is a great book. It was very surprising to me that out of all the different students on all the different campuses at different levels, from high school to undergraduate to graduate school to law school to med school to dental school, and I've spoken at all these different kinds of the environments, the problems are pretty much almost universally the same. That students haven't learned to do anything other than memorize and regurgitate. Nobody has ever given them a system for learning. Nobody has ever shown them Bloom's taxonomy. And for me, Bloom's taxonomy is a huge part of this process. And whenever I talk to faculty, I'll ask, how many of you are not familiar with Bloom's taxonomy? Almost nobody raises their hand because most of us are. When I ask them, how many of you have actively taught Bloom's to your students, maybe 5-10% of the group has. And what I find is that students don't know that there's anything other than memorizing and regurgitating, which is let's talk about the controversy with Bloom's, because the form of Bloom's that I like and the one that I presented in the book is a pyramid. But I do know that when Benjamin Bloom and colleagues developed Bloom's taxonomy in 1957 at the University of Chicago, he didn't mean it as a hierarchical kind of setting. And some people say, well, I don't like the pyramid. I think it needs to be a circle, or it could be the pyramid but turned upside down. So there are a lot of different ideas about that. But I'll tell you why I like the pyramid form. But most students have never heard of Bloom's taxonomy. And I think that Bloom's taxonomy provides the lens through which our students have to view learning, to see what the problem is between what they were currently doing that was not getting the desired amount of learning and the grades that they could be earning versus the level that they need to be operating in order to get another one. So Jamila says, I've seen interacting cogs. Each cog is a different Bloom's level. Yeah, and I think that would be a good model also. And I'll tell you why I like the pyramid. I like the pyramid with remembering at the bottom, knowledge at the bottom, because I think it's very important for students to know that it's crucial that they have some facts in their brain, that they have some information in their brain. So there are some things that they have to memorize. I've had one student in particular when she was taking general chemistry, and there was a formula that she needed to memorize. I mean, she needed to understand the relationships, but there's certain things that they have to memorize. And so I said, no, there's certain things you have to memorize. You have to know them as well as you know your first name, better than your middle name. And she says, oh, no, no, Dr. McGuire. She said, my instructor says that this course is all about understanding. We don't have to memorize anything. Well, she had no facts in her head. And I try to explain to students that you can't solve problems, because now students think that they don't have to know anything because they can look it all up. They'll say, well, back in your day, you didn't have Google, so you had to know stuff, but now we can look up everything. And I try to help them understand you can't solve problems with information you have just looked up on the web. You have to have information that you can manipulate, that you can consider in order to solve problems that you're working on. And this notion that you don't have to know anything has actually permeated itself up into the nation's medical schools. Our older daughter is a faculty member at Baylor College of Medicine, and she said she was rounding with residents one day, and she asked this young man, is it okay to prescribe drugs like Sudafed and Actifed to pregnant women? And she thought he was going to stop and think and say, well, it constricts blood vessels, so probably not. Instead, he whipped out his PDA, called up the physician's desk reference, read a few lines, and said no. And she asked him why, and he was absolutely clueless. And so I like the idea of telling students that, because this is actually the most common way that students get information. They're used to memorizing information, but they're not used to taking the information they're remembering and then moving it to being able to state that information in their own words, which is what understanding is. And then if they're applying, they can answer questions, work problems they've never seen before using the information they've understood. If they're analyzing, they could take any concept, break it into simpler concepts, give me analogies. And then if they're evaluating, they can take any two ideas, theories, determine whether one is more likely to be correct than another. And if they're creating, they can come up with their own ideas, their own theories, their own ways of approaching things. And this is the way I explain it to students. And the students, when I ask them, who's heard of Bloom's, almost nobody has. But when we show them Bloom's, the most common reaction I get from students is, wow, I wish I had known this in high school. Why didn't anybody tell me this before? Because now they understand that the problem is they were just memorizing information. But they are required in our classes to analyze, to evaluate. And I think it's the lens through which students can see that distinction. And so I think not knowing Bloom's taxonomy is huge. Also, underestimating the amount of time that needs to be spent in study, and also not having a way to do it. I'm sure a lot of colleagues out there have heard students say, well, I really just don't know how to study. I never had to study, so I don't know what to do. So there's a study system that I present in the book. We call it the study cycle. It was developed at LSU, where you preview information that's going to be covered in class before you go to class, review as soon after class as possible, and only takes about 10 minutes to do the preview and review, so they've got to do more than that. And we show them how to structure study sessions, set aside about an hour, take a couple of minutes to decide on a goal, then study for 20, 30 minutes with focus and action, then review what they've just studied, and then take a break. Take a break first, come back and review. But it's a system that students have. And those are the problems that I find that are pretty universal, which was surprising to me. It was so much easier to teach students how to learn at a variety of different levels, because the problems were almost all the same and the solutions were very, very similar.
Okay, so we've had a question come in from an audience member who says, how do we discuss faculty resistance that is sometimes, she says, often encountered when thinking about some of these things? I think particularly around study skills. She says, we read it as a book group. Some faculty chalked it up to mollycoddling students.
Exactly.
What are your thoughts on that, Saundra?
Okay. In the book, both the faculty book and the student book, I have a little exercise, and I'm not going to do a spoiler and give it away, but it's the count the vowels exercise. And in that exercise, it is very clear that you could fail a test miserably not because you're not capable of performing very well, but there are other factors involved. And I think what faculty say, they say, we're coddling the students. I didn't have to do this stuff. Nobody did this for me, and I'm fine. And I think the big problem is that faculty, we want to think that our students had the same opportunity to learn and gain these skills as we did. And that is simply totally not true. When we look at the experience of our students coming through school now, where there's such a big emphasis on standardized tests, there's such a big emphasis on memorizing and regurgitating, it's the students are just not having the same experience. And so the fact is, the study skills, the learning strategies that we learned in K-12, our students have never had an opportunity to learn that. And if they're going to learn it, we need to teach it. And so hopefully if some of those people read the book, because one of the chapters in the book is about why are students the way they are? Why don't students already know these things? And I'm hoping that if we read that, and we can engender a little bit of empathy for these students. Now, the other thing that I found really helps faculty is the before and after scores. I have shown them scores where a student made a 42 on the first test, hundreds on everything else. And actually, I guess I'm really big into reflection questions, as you'll see, because I even say that we really shouldn't be telling students what to do. It's much more impactful if we give them reflection questions. And when they answer those reflection questions, they're coming up with the information that we want them to have. And so a reflection question maybe to a faculty group would be, think of a course that you did very poorly in, and one that you think if you took that same course today, you would probably do very well in. What's the difference between what was going on when you took the course and the situation now? And I think that we could get those faculty to recognize that it really is all about the strategies. And they were using strategies that were effective, but our students they've never had a chance to develop that. Give you an example. When we were growing up, if somebody said, what's 3 times 2? We knew that what that meant was you take 3 twice, or you take 2 3 times, and you get 6. Students now, if you say, what's 2 times 3? They know that that means I pick up a calculator, I hit a 3, I hit an X, I hit a 2, and I hit the equal sign. And if they mistakenly hit the 2, hit another 3, and it comes up 9, they have no idea that 9 isn't the correct answer. And so, but if we can show them what multiplication really is, it's serial addition, they'll go, oh, I never knew that. And so I try to help faculty really understand why students are the way they are. And we're still going to have some faculty who are saying, it's coddling. But now the other answer to that is, I think in this country I don't think we ever had the luxury of writing off a whole bunch of people. But now, especially when our colleges are trying to increase retention and graduation rates, even if it is coddling, why not coddle the student to get the skills and then allow them to fly later on? But I think that is a huge problem. But I think I've found that, and I guess I can take myself as an example. I never taught learning strategies. I didn't think that was my job. I taught chemistry. But then when I found out how simple it was to teach students these strategies, and I saw the significant impact, then I was a believer. I'm kind of like a reformed alcoholic now. I have the answer. You can't shut me up. And I've seen over the years, I've seen more faculty converting from this is coddling students to this is what I absolutely need to do if I want my students to improve.
So that is a perfect segue, Saundra, into my next question,
Okay.
Which is,
okay.
If there are a couple simple things that instructors could do pretty much immediately to integrate into their classroom so that they can improve students' awareness of their learning in that course, are there some techniques that instructors can immediately apply?
Absolutely. And one of them is going to address the fact that when students first come to our class, they think they're going to do fine. They have no idea that they're going to have any learning challenges. And it's not until they take that first test that they realize that, oh, there may be a problem here. And I say in the book, for some students, it's when they're taking the first test. But for other students, it's not until they get the first test back, because they still think they did great until they get that test back. And so I think one of the things we can do is give students that wake-up call very early. I used to not give my first test before I knew this information. I gave my first test 4 to 5 weeks into the semester when I thought I had taught enough stuff to cover on the test. When I started learning this, I realized that it was important to give the first quiz or test within the first 2 weeks, because students have to have a wake-up call. And then give them just that 1 hour, 50-minute, 1 hour learning strategy session on metacognition, Bloom's taxonomy, the study cycle, showing before and after scores, where students made a 30 and a 28 on the first 2 tests, and then they made 80s and 90s. Because what has to happen is the students have to recognize that there's a problem. And that needs to come early, because if they don't recognize until 6 weeks in that they've had a problem learning, and they start learning the strategies then, it's almost too late, because when they learn that they've been doing the wrong thing, and now they have to start back at the beginning of the course because they haven't learned that information. So for a while, they're going to be on 2 tracks because we're continuing to go on. And so they're trying to learn what they missed while keeping up with what we're doing. And the closer those 2 tracks are, when the student starts to know the strategies, the better. So we can give our first test or quiz very early. And then when we give it back, go over the learning strategies with students. Now, a lot of times faculty will say, I'm going to tell the students about this the first day of class. Well, I found that it doesn't work great because on the first day of class, nobody's interested, because they think, well, maybe he's talking to all the other dummies in the class who might need this stuff, but certainly not me, because I know I'm going to do well in this class. And so they have to get that first data point that says, no, you're not on the road to doing well. And then when we give them the intervention that shows them exactly the difference between what they had been doing and what they need to do, and the before and after scores, they change their behavior, and then they can see a big impact. The other thing we can do is when students get a test back, ask them to look at the things that they missed, and identify what the problem was. What level of Bloom's taxonomy were the questions that they missed at? Was it that they didn't memorize the information that they needed to memorize? Was it that they had not spent enough time analyzing? So I think we can always call our students' attention to those learning strategies that they could be using. Exam wrappers, I talk about those in the book, having them think about what I'm going to do differently next time. Why did I miss what I missed this time? What learning strategies should I or could I have used that I didn't? And what am I going to do for the next time to make sure that I do better? So testing early and often is one of them. Having students share effective learning strategies. Those are some things.
Okay, so we just had a bunch of questions come in response to your response. So the first one is, do you have that first test be low stakes so that it is safer?
That's an excellent question. Yes, but the students don't know that it's low stakes. Okay, because if the students know that it's low stakes, that it's not going to count like a regular test, or it doesn't have to be a test, it could be a quiz, then they're not going to really prepare for it. And when they don't do well, they'll just tell themselves, well, I didn't do well because I didn't really prepare for it, because I knew it wasn't going to count for very much. And I tell faculty all the time, you can drop that first test or quiz if you want to, but don't let students know that's what's going to happen. But I prefer not dropping the first test, because there will be students who made 100 on the first test. And students are very upset if we're going to drop the quiz or test that they made 100 on. And so I like giving the students the option of not counting this, but instead either replacing the average of all of their other tests for that test grade, or sometimes people replace the final exam score with that test grade. So it's low stakes in the sense that it's not going to count against them. But the students won't know that, because if they knew it, then they wouldn't study for it, and they would just tell themselves, well, I still don't need these learning strategies, because I just need to study the way I would have studied if I had known that it was going to count.
Okay. So the next question is there a quote unquote test in the experimental sense you can give students so they learn their own lesson about how they learn? For example, studying smarter, studying in a group, whatever.
Yeah, I don't know of any tests that will do that, but for me, that's where the reflection questions come in. And somebody who's in it may know of a test. So please put this in the chat box. Oh, and I see someone. Oh, you can always average the two, replace higher score, or drop any one test. There are a lot of options. Oh, so let me actually address the dropping one test. I think that that's a great option, but I discourage us from letting students know at the beginning of the course that the lowest score is going to be dropped. And the reason is because I have seen some students, and when they know that they can drop the lowest score, they will knock themselves out. That's it, they're going to be 4 tests. They'll knock themselves out to make the highest score on the first 3. Then after that, they totally check out of the course because they know that they're going to drop the 4th test. And then when they get to the final exam, they haven't learned anything in the course since the 3rd exam. And many of us on our finals, we emphasize the material that's taught in the latter part of the course. And so I've seen students' grades drop by 2 full letter grades, student going from an A to a C because they checked out of the course after the 3rd exam. So I think it's fine for us to drop a score if we want to, the lowest score, but I wouldn't let students know about that at the very beginning. And now the question that I was answering was about refresh my memory, Katie.
So we've actually, it looks like we've had a clarification too from Steve in the chat. He says, example of a test, divide class into a group of students who prefer studying together and a group of those who prefer to study alone. After each assignment or quiz, report on the average grades of the 2 groups. I'm told that those who study in a group tend to do better. So are there different ways of kind of almost setting up an experimental design, it sounds like?
Yeah, the only problem with setting up experimental designs with people, with humans, is, there's a chapter in the book on the role of emotions in learning, and so if we the students are going to learn better if they are studying in a group. I think that is unquestionable, and I address those the reasons for that in the book. And I tell students that if you study in a group, then you can talk to other students about your ideas. You can hear how they're thinking about the course. So that interaction is going to be very, very beneficial. But there are so many students who prefer to study alone because they don't know that studying in a group is going to be beneficial. And they really, and you've probably heard students say, I can't study with anybody else. I have to study by myself. And so I think that even if we did that experiment and we showed that the students who studied in a group did better, I think that the students who studied alone are still going to think that, no, I just need to study harder alone to do better. And so I actually find it a little bit, now I'm not saying don't do this, because the one thing, and I say this in the Teach Students How to Learn, I am not saying that there is a right way to do this and a wrong way to do this. And so the ideas that you have, I want you to try those ideas, and you'll come up with ideas that I would not have thought of in a million years. So I'm never prescriptive. I never say you need to do it this way and you can't do it that way. But just in my experience with talking with students about working in groups, many of them, this idea that I can't work in groups comes from high school, because when they were in high school, typically when they were in groups, most of the people were not motivated. So they wanted to talk about the party Saturday night. And so they were not in groups with people who were as serious about group work as they were. And so I actually would prefer to not give them an option of working alone, but I would have everybody work in groups and then ask, what was the advantage of working in a group? And sometimes an easy way to do that also is to throw out a question and then have students come up with their individual answer, and then have them work in groups to come up with a group answer. And who's the physics professor, Katie? Do you know what I'm talking about? Who does the clickers?
Yes.
Is it Steve?
Eric
Somebody knows
Mazur.
who I'm talking. Mazur, yeah. Eric Mazur. Thank you, Natalie and Steve. Yeah, Eric Mazur, and a lot of people are doing that now, and they can show that when students talk with their neighbor or in a group, then the whole class converges on the correct answer quicker because they can talk about different ideas. And so the idea of allowing some students to work alone if they prefer to work alone, I don't really like that, because students really prefer to work alone because they're of their past experiences. And I would prefer to have them work with a group and analyze the difference in working with a group. And I think that they can see the benefit of working in a group. And yeah.
All right, so we have a couple more questions. One which came in via email, so I want to make sure we get to that one as well. So we had someone write in and say, "I'm using Dr. McGuire's book."
Okay, actually, Katie.
Yeah.
Katie, I'm sorry. Let me go back, because I do want to address what Jeffrey said in the box. He said group studying depends on the qualities and behaviors of the group. And you're absolutely right about the behaviors. And that's why I actually did a workshop for students at LSU, how to make study groups work for you instead of against you. Because there were people in study groups who wouldn't do anything to prepare for the group. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. So I think that what we need to do as faculty is come up and teach students the group behaviors that are going to be beneficial, and even I tell students, you should kick people out of the group. If they come and they're not contributing, if they haven't prepared, then kick them out of the group. But and they have to assume their responsibility. So you're absolutely on target, Jeffrey. Now, I'm sorry, Katie, I saw that question and I wanted to address it.
No problem.
So,
no problem.
Okay.
All right, so our question over email is, "I'm using Dr. McGuire's book in a course I'm currently running, Teaching Theory and Practice. This course is designed to help students become more effective tutors and TAs, and I was wondering if Dr. McGuire has seen this application of her book before, and if she could share how student teachers, not necessarily the instructor of record, have effectively been able to apply the strategies offered in the book."
Okay. Yes. In fact, because I come out of the Learning Center community, I was director of the Learning Center at Cornell and then at LSU. Well, I was a chemistry professor, and then I was in the Learning Center community, and now I'm very heavily in the faculty development community. So I interact with a lot of Learning Center directors, and quite a few of them use the Teach Students How to Learn in their tutor training programs. And they've had very good success with that. And and Christina says, she's using the book in the same way. So Christina, if you want to just put a few comments in the chat to tell us if you're finding that it's working well or not, then that probably would be helpful to some people. But people have told me that it's really effective with tutors that teach students how to learn, because tutors are very much like faculty. They've been very successful as students, and they see themselves as very smart and capable. And many times they view students as either being capable of success or not. And if we videotaped all of our tutors in sessions or peer advisors, we would see that they actually talk differently to the students who think have ability versus the students who don't. And so I think to teach students how to learn is very effective. And people who've used it in tutor training have said that the tutors have said it was very, very helpful working with their students, but it was also very helpful in their own learning, because now they're getting it from both perspectives. And let's see, and Christina says, I use it with students who are undergraduate teaching assistants. Students responded well to it, both from a student and teacher perspective. One student found the mindset chapter very illuminating. Christina, you took the words right out of my mouth. Thanks so much for putting that in. And yeah, because that's where that idea, mindset, the work of Carol Dweck, the idea that there are certain students who are smart and capable and other students who aren't. I think that's very, very much ingrained in us as faculty, and also in tutors, and also in our students. And and we socialize students to think that either you're born smart and you can do very well in school, or you're not born very smart and you're not going to do very well. Because in elementary school, the students saw those groups. They saw the bluebirds, the sparrows, and the eagles, and they know what those groups were. And by the time they got to 10th and 11th grade, the pecking order had not changed one bit. The slow kids were still the slow kids. The smart kids were still the smart kids. So we socialize kids into thinking that there are smart people and then there are people who are not so smart. And it's that mindset chapter, I think, that will help teaching assistants, instructors, even students recognize that, no, that's not the case. It's about the strategies you use, not about how smart you are. Thanks so much, Christina.
Okay, so we have one more audience question that's come in. I'm curious how to address the amount of time students think they need to succeed in a class. I notice that students often underestimate this, and they have many competing interests that impact how they judge the time needed for durable learning.
Yes, great question. And I actually now have a different philosophy on that within the last year, thanks to Leonard Geddes. I don't know if I'll type his name in the chat box. He's fantastic. He does the Learn Well, Think Well programs. And before I knew of Leonard's work, I would tell students to shoot for doing 2 hours outside of class for every hour inside of class. And sometimes when I talk to students, I'll ask them, how many hours have you heard you need to spend outside of class versus inside? And I will get quite a few students who say 2, but a lot of students say 3. And I always would say that I think 3 is unrealistic. And I tell faculty this, 3 is unrealistic because students just don't have that amount of time, that much time. And if we tell people to do something that's impossible to do, they're not going to do anything at all. And so I thought 2 was much more reasonable. But I'd say that it really depends on the week and it depends on the course. In some courses, for some weeks, you might find yourself spending 3 or 4. But other courses, it might be 1. I'm going to let Christine Rice's course workload estimator really help students and instructors understand just how much work a course can be. Excellent. So thanks, Christina. I didn't know about that. And then Rice University's Teaching Center has a coursework estimator. Excellent. But Leonard's take on it is this. He said he likes to focus less on how much time you have to spend in a course and spend more time on what it takes to master the information. And I think what Leonard does kind of dovetails with what I do, because one of the strategies that I tell students to do to determine if they've really mastered the information is pretend they're teaching it. Pretend they've got an imaginary friend, or if they have empty chairs or pets or whatever, that they're teaching the information. And so they need to spend enough time on it so that they understand it to the level that they could teach it to someone and be able to answer questions. And so I find that if we can get students to focus more on mastering the information and less on how many hours, and thanks for the website, Jeff, how many hours they have to put in, that's a much more healthy approach for students. Because I think there are students who'll say, okay, set my timer, I'm going to put in my 2 hours today on chemistry, and then 2 hours have passed and they've done work, but they've memorized, they've done the homework using examples, and that really has not led to learning. Whereas another student might be able to spend 30 minutes because they've prepared for lecture, they've really focused in lecture and understood the concepts. And so it's more about what you do to master the content than the time. But now, that having been said, because students so underestimate that, I like to tell them that they probably need to shoot for about 2, but the study cycle that we propose in the book that they use, this is a system, and students love it because it teaches those students who say, I don't know how to study, I've never had to study. It gives them a system. We tell them that if you can shoot for doing 2 or 3 of those study cycle sessions during daylight hours and another 1 or 2 at night, they will have studied for 4 to 5 hours that day. And but it doesn't seem like that much, our students tell us, because they break it up and it goes quickly. I see, and Jeffrey said, okay, Leonard's focus is working up to Bloom's taxonomy, over just time. Exactly. Having them move to those higher learning levels as opposed to just the hours that they put in. And Jeffrey also says that students, they love that study cycle. Students at LSU call it that preview review thing. But the students who said, I just don't know how to study, they absolutely love it.
Okay, we are getting close to our end of our time together. Saundra, I want to ask
you. Oh,
no,
not yet. I'm having too much fun.
It's gone so fast. And we've had such wonderful questions from our audience as well. My final question for you is, you've written this book, you've written the partner book, for different audiences. I know you speak on many campuses and give workshops on these issues. What is the most interesting part of kind of working on these things for you? Like what draws you to this material, both maybe in your interactions with campuses, but also in the writing of these books?
Yes. Well, my co-author on the books, and I have to give her kudos, Stephanie McGuire, our younger daughter, who's actually an opera singer who lives in Berlin, but the child has a PhD in neuroscience from Oxford. And she was actually a tutor in her day job in New York City. But I kept getting asked over the years when I was doing the workshops, is there a book? Is there a book? And I said, well, no, but I'll write one when I retire. Was not about to write a book. And Stephanie said, Mom, we can work together on this book. And so we did. And it was very interesting to me to see the information in a way that could be communicated. I tell people all the time, the tone of the book is very much Stephanie. People say the book is fun to read, they enjoy it, and that's all Stephanie's contribution. I would have had the information there, but I don't think it would have been as much fun to read. But Stephanie looked at a lot of my presentations on the web that shouldn't be there, but it's fine if people learn from it. But she looked at that and she said that her goal, she said, Mom, my goal was I wanted people who read the book to have as much fun with the material as the people who were in your workshops were obviously having. And so that's why she gave it that tone. But I thought about her because one of the phrases that she used was, she said, Mom, you find student success and increasing student learning intoxicating. And I really do. Once I found that it was so easy to give students these strategies and they could go from making D's and F's to A's and B's, it's just, it's so exciting because so many of our students, especially first generation students, they come to our campuses with the hopes and dreams of their families. And when they're struggling, they don't know how to fix it. Their families don't know how to fix it, but this information can. And because it's so simple, I just find I'm just energized by the idea that I can help faculty and students know something that is so simple that we could teach students, and so more of our students could be successful. But the other thing that students tell me is that learning then becomes fun. When they were just in memorization, regurgitation mode, everything was just so tedious. But now that they have a process for learning the information, then they find it more interesting. And that's what really charges me up and keeps me going.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Saundra. We did have a final question come in for me, actually. So I will answer it just very quickly, which is somebody wanted to know, where am I going internationally? Because there's a passport on my bookshelf. And the quick answer is nowhere. I just keep it there. So I have no immediate travel plans, but let me just get that in so that
I'll be going to Singapore. My passport isn't on the bookshelf back there, but it's in my closet that you can't see. But I'll be in Singapore in December.
Oh, that's so fun. Amazing. Well, I want to thank everybody who joined us today for this third in the series of the Stylus Author webinars. If you registered for this series, all the replays for all three of the webinars we've done so far are housed in the same space. And please also keep an eye out for our fall webinar that we're going to be doing with a couple more Stylus authors in October. Date to be announced. But if you're part of this series, you'll get an automated email that will let you know when that is coming up. So I hope you will enjoy that as well. But Saundra, I want to thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And I'm seeing thank yous in the chat box. Thank you, everybody, for your enthusiastic participation. And I'm just going to give out my email address, Katie, because they don't have that, do they? I don't think. Okay. Oh, actually, I'll put it in the chat box. It's smcgu. Okay, let me go back. The C didn't come out. Okay, smcgui and the number 1 at lsu.edu. So feel free to email me, or if you have other questions, comments, if you've had successes, then please do. And it's been wonderful talking with you this afternoon. And have a great, if you're ending your semester, have a great break. Have a wonderfully productive and relaxing summer.
All right. Thanks, everybody. You'll be getting an email a little bit later on today with information about the replay video. Please also feel free to share it with colleagues if you think they would find it useful. If you want to check out Saundra's book, many of you seem to be very familiar with it, but you can also click the box at the bottom to learn a little bit more about the book and Saundra's other work as well. Thanks so much for joining us today, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.